It's almost Valentine's Day, so time to talk about my true love, Isekais. Isekais and reverse Isekais are, unfortunately, my favorite trope in the fantasy genre. Look, I read too many of them for them not to be my favorite, okay? And since the hit series Solo Leveling is a reverse Isekai, now's the best time to not only learn what the heck a reverse Isekai is, but also to dive into some new, fun fantasy worlds that you might have missed. To know what a reverse Isekai is, we first gotta define an Isekai, which is actually pretty simple. Isekais are when a dumb, boring, everyday, ordinary human gets yeeted into a fun fantasy world. It's as simple as that. Now the, let's say, method of delivery differs from series to series, but the particulars don't typically matter all that much. Meanwhile, one would assume the reverse Isekai is the opposite, but one would be wrong. Kind of. A reverse Isekai has two main elements to them, the world and the fantasy. Like an Isekai, there needs to be a mundane, boring, everyday world, but instead of a person going into the fantasy world comes to the person. Or technically, everyone. It comes to everyone. And there's a lot of ways you can go about this, starting with the best of the best, Omniscient Reader, which is a story about stories. We follow Kim Doksha, a man obsessed with reading stories. He's just like me for real. No, don't show my Webtoon recap, that's embarrassing. One story in particular, known as 3 Ways to Survive the Apocalypse. And we start at the end of his favorite story, with a warning, which is when the world gets thrown into chaos, as the world of 3 Ways to Survive the Apocalypse becomes the real world. And the kicker, Kim Doksha is the only one who's read the entire story, so he knows what to expect, what to do, and how to thrive. There's a lot of reasons Omniscient Reader works so well, but the series is almost a clever wink and nod to readers. Kim Doksha himself is an overpowered protagonist, but not in the traditional sense. He's not super strong or skilled or handsome or lucky, but he's smart and knowledgeable, being able to adapt to his new situation because he's a reader. Not to mention, everything in the series is meant to point to stories and readers being important. The world is viewed by powerful deities known as constellations. It's being streamed by the Dokkaebi. People gain powers through creating stories. Omniscient Reader is a story made for readers about readers. Meanwhile, Newbie focuses on the infamous VR game The Tower of Trials, and the only man to beat it, Kang Jin-hyuk. And when he finally does, the infamous Tower of Trials emerges into the real world, and humanity is forced to climb it to stop the apocalypse. Reverse Isekais already usually have video game-like skills and systems with stats and special traits and abilities. It's great, I love it. And having the invading fantasy aspect to just be a video game, especially for a nerd like me, is the best. Like Omniscient Reader, Kang Jin-hyuk knows this game the best, and therefore uses it to his advantage as he grows wildly powerful. But unlike Kim Doksha, Kang Jin-hyuk is 1000% a menace. He's selfish, he's greedy, he's kind of a jerk and a terrible person, but it's weirdly great. He's just an absolute blast to watch as he tricks others, gains advantages and powers, and uses his knowledge to become the strongest. And finally, we have I Was the Final Boss. Unlike other series, it doesn't stand out because of how the world got isekai, but because of who we follow. You see, a reverse isekai is about humans adapting to the fantasy world that invades their home. But what if we flip that? What about the fantasy world itself? Like the name suggests, I Was the Final Boss focuses on Baphomet, a boss of a dangerous tower that humanity faces. We follow his love for fighting humans that quickly descends into boredom and yearning for freedom, even jealousy of humanity, until he finally does get that freedom, dying and being reincarnated as a human, finally getting to live life as one, finally getting that freedom that he so desperately wanted, with all the ups and downs that it comes with. Not to mention, our main character, who was a demon, now has to act as a human, which is great. You see, the reverse isekai is a simple premise. If fantasy doesn't exist, then randomly it does. And like every premise or trope out there, it's not going to carry a story. It won't magically create an interesting or fun series. Instead, a good reverse isekai doesn't solely rely on its trope, but builds off it. It does something new, something more with it. Omniscient Reader creates a meta story about stories and readers. Newbie creates adrenaline-pumping fun for readers to enjoy. And I Was the Final Boss is a clever twist on what you'd expect in a fantasy world. These series aren't great because they're reverse isekais, but take a simple premise and expand upon it in some great ways. So if you've given up on the isekai trope because they're boring or unoriginal, I implore you to give them another shot over on Webtoon today.